Welcome. I'm Dr. Ed Lengel. I'm the Chief Historian at the National Medal of Honor Museum in Arlington, Texas. And I'm pleased to welcome all of you to this very exciting interview with Richard B. Frank as we commemorate the 80th anniversary of the attack at Pearl Harbor, at which 15 medals of honor were awarded for actions on that date, December 7th, 1941. Richard B. Frank was born in Kansas and graduated from the University of Missouri in 1969. After that, he served for 4 years in the United States Army. And during the Vietnam War, he served a tour of duty as a platoon leader with the 101st Airborne Division. And he then graduated from Georgetown University Law Center and became a practicing lawyer. But he is the author of several brilliant books, beginning with Guadalcanal, the definitive account of the landmark battle, which was published in 1990. Downfall, the End of the Imperial Japanese Empire, published in 1999. MacArthur in 2007, and most recently, the first book in a trilogy, and it's really an excellent book, promises to be a great trilogy, and we'll be discussing it more today. The title is Tower of Skulls, A History of the Asia-Pacific War, July 1937 to May 1942, and that's published by W.W. Norton. Obviously, that includes Pearl Harbor that we'll be discussing today. So Rich, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor and privilege to be on an event for this institution.
Thank you. So let's look at the subject of your book, Tower of Skulls. You take a big picture look at the origins of the Pacific War. And we as Americans, we think, oh, it all began in 1941. Obviously, that's not true. And you take it back to 1937. Can you place Pearl Harbor in context for us as what happened up to that time, why it took place, what was the background?
Right. I think it was most aptly captured by historian David Kennedy, who said, if you want to explain the U.S. war with Japan, there's a one-word explanation, and that word is China. And for that purpose, we need to go back, really starting in 1931, which I do talk about. At that time, a group of radical Imperial Army officers staged the seizure of the Chinese area called Manchuria. They did so without authorization from Tokyo. A Japanese prime minister tried to interfere. He was assassinated. And effectively, from that moment forward, Japan was not a nation with an army, but an army with a nation. And those radical officers, that also included many officers in the Imperial Navy, had notion of a great Japanese empire, but they had no notion about what the limits of that were. Now, for China in 1931, the Manchurian incident, as they called it, was simply another episode in what the Chinese now call the century of humiliation, which started with the first Opium War in 1839. And it was a period in which no central Chinese government had managed to sustain combat with westernized power for more than a few months and never more than a year. China was basically regarded widely as a fleckless doormat, whatever here. So the leader of Japan, and he was really the leader of a coalition, Chiang Kai-shek, who had recently taken that position, he viewed the Manchurian incident as the clear signal to him that for China to restore its sovereignty, which was his goal, it was going to involve a showdown war with Japan. But he understood, much better than some of his critics did, just how incredibly difficult that was going to be. And he embarked, we now know from the historiography of the last couple of decades, a huge program to mobilize China, both the armed forces and the nation itself, for such a battle. Well, in 1937, there was another of one of many incidents between Chinese and Japanese soldiers, but the Japanese were seizing upon it to advance much deeper into northeastern China, down, in fact, to Beijing. And Chiang decided that that was the limit he could go. He could no longer ask for the patience of the Chinese people to wait for a better time to make war. A war broke out July, August 1937. And between that date and the end of 1938, there were tremendous levels of conventional fighting, basically along the Chinese coast and up the Yangtze River. Chiang's main force, which was the premier force of the Chinese forces, his National Army, was very heavily engaged, suffered very, very heavy losses in fighting the Japanese. At that time, the Chinese communist contribution to that was very small. The Japanese were generally successful. they kept advancing. They took Shanghai, they took Nanjing in an episode now referred to as the Nanjing massacre. They took the Wuhan cities. But at the end of 1938, having gone deeply into China in some areas and conquered the most prosperous and populous areas, the Japanese suddenly awoke to the realization that if the Chinese were not going to give in and Chiang was not going to give in, there was no military means by which they could end the war. And the war then entered sort of this gray phase where the Japanese were trying other methods to subdue China. And the Chinese continued resistance, although at a lower level because they used up a lot of their men, a lot of their munitions. Now, where this ties into the US is follows. From 1933 to 1941, the American people had a good idea that Hitler was a really evil individual. And he, of course, spewed hatred towards Jews and other people. He persecuted them. But during that interval, certainly up to June 1941, there was no mass killing by the Germans anywhere. In stark contrast to that, the Japanese war in China from 37 to 41 was marked by horrendous levels of combat and slaughter of non-combatants. By June of 1941, about 7.5 million Chinese were dead. 6 million of them were non-combatants. And what was important to the American people was, rather than simply reading text about that, they were accumulating an enormous visual library of still images and newsreels that recorded in very graphic detail what the Japanese had been doing in China, bombing, slaughtering civilians, slaughtering soldiers. The American people had no parallel library of visual imageries about Nazi Germany. As a consequence, the American people shifted from the very early phase where they were sort of ambivalent about what was going on, probably an expectation China was going to fold up, to becoming extremely partisan with respect to how the war was going. And by February 1940, the American people are asking, who do you favor in the war? And Japan could muster 2%, and China got 76%. And this resulted in enormous public pressure on President Roosevelt to take measures, and he did, cutting off the supply of airplanes and then scrap metal and various other things that would impede Japan's war effort. But he drew the line at one point, and that was petroleum. The US was providing Japan with about 75 to 80% of its petroleum. Now you can look at that as sort of a moral issue that we were effectively subsidizing this mass slaughter of Chinese. But Roosevelt believed, with good reason, I think, that he was not sure that a united American people would support a war against Japan that would involve taking up cudgels on behalf of a European colonial power, which in this case was the Dutch, which where the petroleum was, that he believed the Japanese would go down and seize that if we cut off oil. And that was the big stopping point for Roosevelt in terms of measures against Japan. Well, that was true until June 1941. Hitler attacks the Soviet Union for the first part of the first several days. It appears as though it's going to be another German triumph. Everyone except Great Britain had, of course, fallen to Germany up to that point. Then the last 10 days of July 1941, the German advance halts, and for the first time, it looks like the Soviets would survive. Strategically, this, of course, is stupendous in terms of the outcome of the war, to actually be able to get the Soviets to continue fighting against the Germans. And as they look around for things to do, both in Washington and in London, because they both recognize what's going on, they realized the British were overstretched, were not ready. The logistics of getting anything to the Soviet Union are terrible. The one thing they identify immediately that they can do is keep one thing they identify they can do is to keep Japan from attacking the Soviet Union, which they believe will be a knockout blow against the Soviets. So keeping China in the war becomes a primary strategic objective for the US. Concomitant with that is the recognition that if you want to keep the Japanese from attacking the Soviet Union, cutting off the oil will certainly disable the Japanese from doing that. Now, he recognizes that that's likely to run the risk of war with Japan, but the more important issue is keeping the Soviets in the war, and that's where the oil embargo comes. In the negotiations between Japan and the US in the second half of 1941, the Japanese regard getting out of the China quagmire as their supreme difficulty, and they have two proposals. They want us to agree to impose a peace that signifies Japan's victory over the Chinese, or they want us to completely abandon the Chinese, expecting the Chinese will then fold up because they're holding out expectations of having allies join them. This, of course, is entirely unacceptable to us. So we're in an impasse on the diplomacy, And that's the path that leads up to the attack on Pearl Harbor.
So, given all of this, the strong possibility of conflicts between the United States and Japan had been anticipated for quite some time. And obviously, the military planning had been based on that contingency and the possibility, from the United States point of view, that the focus, if there was a war taking place, if the United States did get involved in war in Europe and the Pacific at the same time, that the Pacific would be the priority. That was the assumption for quite some time. So, how do we explain the massive surprise? uh, how were the Japanese able to achieve such total surprise in the attack on Pearl Harbor?
That's a good question. It's one obviously that's lingered ever since that time. I think the first thing to keep in mind is what historian Gordon Pang said many years ago, which is to regard Pearl Harbor not simply as an American failure, but as a Japanese success. The Japanese achieved surprise, in my view, because they had two things going for them. One was surprise at three levels of war in four different ways. And secondly, a very effective deception program. Let me take those in order. There had been study of war with Japan, especially by the US Navy, for decades before the Pearl Harbor attack. And in that study, the American Navy and indeed the Imperial Navy in Japan came to the same conclusion, that the correct strategy for Japan was to keep its main fleet in the Western Pacific and wait for the US fleet to trundle across the Central Pacific for a battle then on Japan's terms. So strategically, the whole concept that was in the minds of US naval officers was there would be a war with Japan, but Japan would strike Guam and the Philippines, but not go as far as the Central Pacific. Now, operationally, what the Japanese had never displayed before was the actual capability or intention to project a part of the fleet out to the Central Pacific. So that part of it was that piece of it was also a surprise. And then the other part of the operational level is they massed 6 carriers in one formation, which of course enormously increased the striking power of carrier aviation. Now, the reason why the US Navy, which was well aware of the potentials of aircraft carriers, the reason why they discounted that was because the US Navy also was deeply concerned about the vulnerability of carriers, especially before the days of radar and effective fighter control. And so the US Navy and the Imperial Navy, up until April 1941, both followed the program of dispersion, or as the saying goes, don't put all your eggs in one basket. That was how carriers were managed. They were not massed in one big formation that might result in a catastrophic loss, which is exactly what happened to the Japanese 6 months later at Midway. And finally, you have the tactical level. And the Japanese developed torpedoes that could be used effectively in the very shallow waters of Pearl Harbor, which was just simply a tactical, but no one thought the Japanese could do that. Now, in deception, the Japanese did two things. First of all, the strike force that sailed across to make the attack maintained absolute radio silence. All the stories that they were transmitting or in any other way issuing symptoms that they were out there is just totally bogus. The Japanese side is very firm, absolute radio silence. Now, they received messages, but they didn't send any. So they concealed where the carriers really were. But then they added to that, providing a bogus version of where they were. And they did this very simply by a trick. In those days, radio communications were executed by the hand manipulation of a telegraphic key. And to experienced radio operators, other operators all had the distinctive what they called a fist. If you listened to the transmissions of various radio men, you could tell who was who. Well, they had associated a bunch of these guys with Japanese carriers. So the Japanese offloaded their regular radio men and left them back in Japan to generate dummy traffic, which gave the impression that because that's where the radio men were transmitting from, that was where the carriers were. So you have this enormous level of both surprise and this very effective deception, which was way beyond anything that we had anticipated.
I hate to even bring up the subject, but every time Pearl Harbor is discussed, as you know, that old allegation resurfaces that President Franklin D. Roosevelt was delighted that Pearl Harbor took place because it allowed him to do what he'd always wanted to do, get the United States into World War II. And then, in fact, he even knew about it or somehow anticipated or even engineered it. Can you address that and dispose of it?
Well, I can't say it's like killing a vampire. You need a wooden stake or something like that. First of all, look, I've done a really deep dive on this, through all the conspiracy swamps or whatever here, and they're really, when you really understand everything that goes on, there's just no validity to that. Now, what you also have to understand, however, and this goes back to what I talked about earlier. Okay, Roosevelt identified Nazi Germany as the supreme threat. And he would very much wanted to get the US in the war against Germany. But he also very much, as the British did in London and the Soviets did in Moscow, they wanted the US in the war, but only focused on Germany. None of them wanted any diversion of US effort to fighting Japan. So throughout that period, Roosevelt was, in fact, when he was managing public opinion on what to do with the Japanese, he was very cautious because, although on the one hand, he had to respond, but he didn't want to provoke a war with Japan that would divert our main effort away from what he regarded as absolute supreme, most important thing. It's also true that in the 2 weeks or so immediately prior to the Japanese strike, we accumulated a lot of intelligence that showed the Japanese had massed large air, sea, and land forces in Japan and the Western Pacific, in anticipation of doing exactly what we expected, which was that if they struck, their principal aim would be to seize resources, and particularly the petroleum in the Dutch East Indies. And they expected the Japanese would also hit Guam and Philippines, which the Navy had expected from the beginning over here. But no one expected the Japanese, and for the reasons I indicated, that they would attempt to send a major part of their fleet out to the Central Pacific. That was simply beyond the comprehension of what was going on. And Roosevelt, there's absolutely no truth that we were actually breaking Japanese naval codes. We were reading their diplomatic codes, but none of those diplomatic codes gave us a clear indication that Pearl Harbor was going to be struck. And we were not reading the Japanese naval operational codes. So that is all completely bogus or whatever here. In fact, we were reading virtually none of the codes, and that went on for some time. The Japanese had changed not only their code, but their cipher. I'm sorry, they changed their cipher on 4 December 1941, after they changed it only a month before. We didn't really begin major breakbacks into their naval operational code until beginning in March, and then increasingly through April and May, before the Japanese changed again and we were shut out again for quite a while. It was a very laborious process. We had very limited resources devoted to radio intelligence at any level at that time. And I talk about in the book about when you compare this to what was eventually mounted, it's just a tiny fraction of what we later had, and we were having great success. So for all these reasons, no, he didn't plot to get us into war by what's sometimes called the back door to war. And no, he had no advanced knowledge, and no, Churchill had no advanced knowledge, and either didn't share it or secretly told Roosevelt or whatever here. But this has been one of the great fonts of conspiracy theories in American history, and there's apparently no end to it. Although it has honestly diminished over the last several decades from sort of the fever pitch it was at for about the first 3, 4, 5 decades after the war.
Well, excellent points. But as you know, in history, some people don't like to let facts get in the way of a good story, but
Yeah.
very convincing to me. Let's talk about the course of the action itself and the Japanese attack and the American response, such as it was. You used the phrase a moment ago regarding aircraft carriers, not to put all of your eggs in one basket, but that is very nearly what happened. And the bottom nearly fell out of that basket had the American aircraft carriers actually been there at Pearl Harbor. Can you talk a bit about the course of the attack and describe how fortunate it was that those carriers were not there?
A couple of preliminary points. Once again, because we were picking up all these clear signs, the Japanese were coiling to strike, particularly in November 1941. Both the Navy and the Army sent what were later termed war warning messages to the Pacific and Far East commanders. And these are often cited to sort of make Washington an innocent party in this thing. The problem was, when you really get down to reading the messages, there's a lot of problems with them. The single most important one is that they did talk about their expectations of certain targets being hit, mentioned the Philippines, Guam, whatever here. Not one of them mentioned Pearl Harbor as a possible target of attack, whatever here. Unfortunately, the Army commander in Hawaii, General Walter C. Short, I think he was clearly deficient because although he'd had a relatively high level of alert in the several months before December 7th, for reasons which have never been satisfactorily explained, after he got his war warning message on 27 November, he actually lowered the level of alert. He went simply an alert against sabotage or subversion. He effectively notified Washington of that. Washington did not tell him that that was a wrong step over here. And according to a 1936 inter-service agreement, in point of fact, the Army was responsible for defense of the fleet when it was in harbor, like at Pearl Harbor. And because the Army's state of alert was so low, there was enormous culpability by the Army for what happened. The Navy was Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, was very focused on his very ambitious offensive plans. And so he was not using the air assets, the search planes he might have. But I think he was so focused on that, no matter how many search planes we sent him, he would have done anything. Now, as to what actually happens on the day of the attack, we actually received 3 tactical warnings that the attack might be coming. The Japanese had launched 2 cruiser float planes much earlier to scout to see whether those American carriers were in Pearl Harbor, and they reported back there. But we picked them up on radar, but 2 stray planes was not going to occasion a major alert. Then we had 2 very important tactical warnings. The destroyer Ward was on sentry duty outside Pearl Harbor. It attacked and sank one of the Japanese midget submarines that had been sent to attack Pearl Harbor. It issued an urgent message alerting to that. The duty officer of the Pacific Fleet, however, did not issue an alert. And meanwhile, in what became a famous story, these 2 Army privates were monitoring a radar set, and they actually had been supposed to turn it off at 7 a.m., but they kept it running, waiting for their chow truck. And all of a sudden, the oscilloscope shows this enormous blip, bigger than anything they'd ever seen. And so they called it into the Air Control Center, and that had been shut down, actually. There was, however, lingering behind this one fighter pilot who was there for observation and training. And he had heard of this flight of B-17s coming in that morning from the West Coast. And when they said they had this blip, he assumed it was the B-17s. And by incredible good fortune for the Japanese, the tracks of the 2 flights were very close together. So that guy's perception was not so radically wild. The privates did not convey to him that, well, this has to be a lot more than a dozen aircraft. So that chance was missed. So we missed the tactical warnings, which might have at least permitted some readiness to receive the attack by anti-aircraft guns. Well, the Japanese launched 2 strikes, total of 350 aircraft exactly, in 2 waves. The first wave arrived just a little before 8 a.m. It split up to attack various installations on Oahu. The Japanese actually sent more aircraft to knock out American air installations than to attack the ships in Pearl Harbor because they were afraid of a counterattack against their carriers over here. The first bombs fell on those air installations because those planes had a little bit shorter distance to fly to reach their launch positions. The attack on the harbor is believed to have started roughly about 7:48, 7:50, something like that, maybe 7:55 in the morning. One interesting fact about the attack is that the great majority of the most serious damage was inflicted in the first 10 minutes. After that, the effectiveness of the attack dropped off very dramatically. There are 2 basic reasons for that. First of all, the initial strikes created these enormous dense clouds of smoke, which obscured a lot of the ships and a lot of the harbor or whatever here. And secondly, the cloud ceiling diminished, which also impeded the attack. But the other thing that was so critical was the ships reacted with vigorous anti-aircraft fire much faster than the Japanese aviators ever expected. They were shocked, in fact, at how rapid and how vigorous was the result. Nonetheless, the Japanese, in the course of the attack, would kill 2,403 Americans, the vast majority of them service personnel. They sank 5 of the 8 battleships in Pearl Harbor. They damaged 2 others, but not severely. They sank 3 destroyers and 1 auxiliary vessel. Altogether, they also destroyed about 174 American aircraft. And in the course of that attack, the Japanese only lost 29 planes with about 53 airmen and 5-midget submarines with 9 crewmen. So 62 Japanese died, which is almost an exchange rate of deaths, about nearly 41 during the attack. Now, from the tactical and operational level, it was an enormous success. No two ways about it, whatever here. But seldom has there been an event where a nation has gone to war with such enormous victories, tactically and operationally, at the beginning of the conflict, that was not, in fact, strategically a calamitous disaster, because it basically took off the table the prospect of any negotiated settlement, which is what the Japanese were aiming for. They knew they couldn't absolutely force capitulation. They were looking for a negotiated settlement, and Pearl Harbor just about totally obliterated any chance they were going to get that.
You referred to how the Japanese were shocked by the rapidity with which the Americans delivered anti-aircraft fire from the first appearance of the Japanese aircraft over Pearl Harbor. And one of the things that suggests is that the overwhelming majority of the men on the ground or on their ships sought to do their duty as well as they possibly could under incredibly adverse circumstances. And of course, the Medal of Honor is awarded for instances of heroism above and beyond the call of duty, not just men who do what they must do as sailors, as soldiers, as the case may be, but for those who go that extra distance and voluntarily put themselves in harm's way or do other things in order to fight the enemy. So let's talk about those actions. I know you've studied these in some detail. There are 15 of them. I think some of your initial comments reflect how many of those were posthumous.
Right. Let me just note to begin with that all the medals of honor that were awarded for the Pearl Harbor attack were by the U.S. Navy. There were none by the U.S. Army for that attack. There were 15 medals of honor that eventually were awarded for the attack on Pearl Harbor. If you break that down, one of the first things you notice is that 10 of the 15 were posthumous. That's a rate of death of 67%. Of the other 5, 2 of the servicemen were very seriously wounded or injured of smoke and fume inhalation from fires. So basically, the one thread that really links the great majority of the awards is that they were either killed or they were very seriously wounded. And what I found out that surprised me, I had never noticed this before, is that the Navy during all of World War II only awarded 57 medals of honor. So the Pearl Harbor attack accounted for 26, a quarter of all the medals of honor awarded by the U.S. Navy in World War II, which is in some ways a sort of extraordinary that they did this. Now, if you break the 15 awards down further, 6 of which were for individuals who knowingly sacrificed their lives to save their shipmates. 2 of them, they were all very poignant stories. 2 of them in particular, those stand out. The battleship Oklahoma was hit by multiple torpedoes very early in the attack and commenced to capsize, roll over, whatever here. And an enlisted man and a ensign who were in the 2 of the main battery turrets of Oklahoma stood by with flashlights to show the path for the shipmates to escape, and they perished. And there were other stories like this of individuals maintaining their position. There was a chief water tender on the Utah who got everybody out of his compartment. He stayed behind to make sure the boilers didn't explode, and of course died. These stories are all extremely poignant over here. Now, of the next group, I'd say 6, they were all, the citations basically indicate they were awarded the decoration because they materially contributed to saving their ship or large numbers of their shipmates. 2 of those individuals also perished, whatever here. Another level you can look at this at is leadership. 3 of the awards that were not for sacrificing your life involved a enlisted gunner, which is like a warrant officer grade, and 2 senior chiefs, which are senior enlisted grades for the Navy. They, of course, were expected to display leadership, but all 3 of those individuals were just, when you read about what they did, this was way beyond any ordinary level of leadership. One of the tremendous stories is a chief named Hill, who was on the Nevada. When the attack started, he jumped off the ship, swam to where the ship was moored to release the mooring lines so the ship could get underway, swam back to the ship, and was carrying on in a highly heroic fashion when he was killed by a bomb. The other two individuals also did tremendously heroic feats of fighting fires, pulling shipmates from flooded compartments and things like that. So you have all these stories. You see that when you talk about above and beyond, these were all clearly instances of well above and beyond. Now let me talk about a couple of the other awards that come up. There were two that were given, one to Admiral Isaac Kidd, one to Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg of the Arizona. They both were killed in the Titanic explosion that destroyed the Arizona. There was no living witness who saw exactly what they did. Of course, there's no basis to believe they did anything less than their duty. And one researcher found out that their names were not on the list of proposed medals of honor that were forwarded from Pearl Harbor by the Pacific Fleet. That was all done in Washington. And we really don't have a good understanding of exactly why those awards were given, beyond the fact that, at least in my view, I suspect that part of the reasoning that was on people's minds was that it was, in effect, a symbolic tribute to the fact that so many of the Arizona crewmen were killed. About 48% of all the Americans who died in the Pearl Harbor attack died on the Arizona. And I think that probably played into it, but we really don't know exactly what went on to make those awards or whatever here. I would add that the Navy was not generous in giving awards to admirals. You go through those 57 awards, and no, you're not going to see numerous. In fact, you can see very few. And the one other admiral who was given an award, Theodore Chandler, actually was horribly burned when a kamikaze struck his ship. He manned a fire hose to fight the fire with other sailors, even though he was mortally wounded. And basically, his actions, anyone of any rank who did what Theodore Chandler did would have been a candidate for a Medal of Honor. So it was nothing about him being an admiral that got him a Medal of Honor. The other two awards are the senior survivor of Arizona, who was a fellow named Fuqua, and the captain of the ship Vestal, repair ship Vestal, which was alongside the Arizona, Commander Casson Young. And both of their decorations apparently are for their leadership, respectively on the Arizona and the Vestal. And I would have to say that the write-ups are pretty generic. They're not as specific. You read the others, you really see a clear basis for the awards. But those two, as with Kidd and Van Valkenburg, it's really not, doesn't leap out at you. This is not to say that either one of them didn't. This could be simply a fault with the writer, which I sort of gets, that's sort of a segue into that whole awards process.
So before we talk more about the awards process, and you have some direct experience of that awards process from your service in Vietnam, and we'll get to that in just a moment, but I want to talk a little bit about the symbolism which you referred to. This is such a powerful moment in American history. And as you say, the actions themselves are all incredibly poignant. We at the Medal of Honor Museum, as we design our galleries, which we're doing right now, will be focusing on Pearl Harbor in a large part of our galleries, and we're going to highlight the actions of Flaherty and Ward. I believe were the two men who carried the flashlights. To me, that's so powerful symbolically and can be used as an educational tool. We're already thinking about how do you work with students, give them a flashlight, think about using that flashlight in the same way to guide and to help your fellow human beings. And there's so many instances like this that you can understand its enduring power. So can you speak a little bit about the symbolism of Pearl Harbor at the time and in the immediate aftermath of the attack, and how it became such a powerful symbolic rallying cry for the United States entry into World War II?
Yeah, for Americans, there's sort of two elements to it. The first of which was the attack itself that, of course, caused a tremendous damage and tremendous loss of life. The second key element was that the Japanese, literally up to the moment of the attack, have been acting as though they were conducting negotiations in good faith. So the lack of a declaration of war and the nature of the attack was, just incredibly infuriating to virtually every American. I mean, and I would have to emphasize also that I've talked about this in other contexts. What you have to understand is that it wasn't as though the American people were sort of bumbling along, oblivious to what was going on with respect to Japan. I mean, prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, the American people had already worked up a tremendous level of fervor about the gross, atrocities being committed by Imperial Japan and China. So they were already in a very high state of dudgeon when the Pearl Harbor attack was almost like throwing kerosene on a raging fire. So they built upon each other to really infuriate them, and became a symbol that was used throughout the war. Remember Pearl Harbor became a slogan that would continue on throughout the war. Now, the legacy of that, there's several ways. It continued to be remembered very distinctly by the American people for decades. Certainly all those who lived through the moment never forgot where they were when they learned about it. The more pragmatic or direct legacies are, first of all, it was directly related to the decision post-war to unify the armed services. That was seen to be a major problem because there was no unified command at Pearl Harbor. And secondly, it led to the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency because it was thought that it was absolutely essential to have one central source of intelligence interpretation that presumably would prevent us from being surprised in the future. That hasn't exactly worked out that way, but that was thought behind it. So those were the sort of pragmatic aspects about it. And of course, the principles that were thought to be taught by Pearl Harbor, which have lingered on since then, is that you have to always be on the alert and prepared to defend yourself against a sudden strike by some foreign power.
Okay, so let's get back then to the awards process, and this is something that really brings the story up to the present day. As we were just talking about, it was symbolically very powerful at the time. It remains maybe not as raw today as it was in 1941 and 1942, but Pearl Harbor is still a very symbolic moment. And the awards for heroism at Pearl Harbor remain very important to us as Americans. There are ongoing, continuing reviews, not just of this, but of World War I potential recipients, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, many others, for many different reasons, individuals who may be considered now to have been worthy and for whatever reason did not receive the Medal of Honor at that time. So can you, and of course there are reviews ongoing and debates ongoing about individuals who fought at Pearl Harbor, who perhaps demonstrated extraordinary heroism. Can you talk a bit, and also from your personal experience, and how the military awards process works? It's different in the Navy and the Army, and of course now there's an Air Force Medal of Honor as well. How that works, how we can account for the need for continuing reviews of these actions, and what it means today.
Well, let me start with one really fundamental principle, and that's that in terms of disparities or failure to award or inappropriate awards, the single most determining factor about this is the existence of witnesses. If you don't have witnesses, there's virtually no chance that a Medal of Honor, or in fact almost any decoration, is going to be awarded. Someone to tell the story after the event. Now, my experience was at a low level, but it did give me some insight into that. One of the other issues that comes up is that some individual did something really remarkable, above and beyond the call of duty. Well, my experience taught me that one of the most important things in terms of advancing a recommendation for that is that it's critical to describe exactly what was done. One of the big mistakes about decorations at any level is to try to substitute flowery language for a description of what the individual did. When you read those citations for Pearl Harbor, I mean, they almost all, with a couple of exceptions, they show you that they're very straight to the point, and the simple actions they list tell you immediately, well, yes, this would be actions that would merit a Medal of Honor. Now, there's one other important feature about the era of Pearl Harbor, and that's that at that time, we did not have what we now call the Pyramid of Honor, which has Medal of Honor at the top. Then right below that, for the Navy and the Marine Corps, you have the Navy Cross. In the period of World War II, the Army and then the Army Air Force, which was not an independent service at that time, you had the Distinguished Service Cross. And then below that was the Silver Star, and then the Bronze Star. And then there was also the Navy, for instance, had a Commendation Medal, which could be awarded for valor also. At the time of Pearl Harbor, the Navy did not have that whole system. In fact, we didn't have that whole system in place. You had the Medal of Honor, you had the Navy Cross. And that plays a role in how it's decided who gets what. You only really have two gradations. And those later editions of gradations, I think, made for a better way to sample out what truly is above and beyond the call of duty. In fact, at the time of Pearl Harbor, the US Navy had no existing legal authorization to award the Purple Heart Medal for wounds. The Army had adopted this due to General MacArthur in the 1930s as a basis for the Purple Heart, besides being meritorious service, also combat wounds. The Navy had made no parallel move. And in the first year of the Pacific War, there was this obvious gross disconnect where if you were a naval personnel serving under a theater commander who was Army, like Joe MacArthur, and you were wounded, you could get a Purple Heart. If you were serving under a Navy commander, Admiral Nimitz, and you were wounded, no Purple Heart. That was corrected by an executive order in December of 1942, which is about the time we started getting this whole Pyramid of Honor put into place. So those two factors. The other thing is there's absolutely no way you can come up with a checklist of how do you get a Medal of Honor, A, B, C, D, E. It has to be left subjective because the circumstances are always going to be so different. And when you interject human judgment into this, that's of course where ultimately, once you move to the more difficult cases, you're going to get different results. I mean, those guys who gave their lives to save their shipmates under any system, they clearly would have been awarded. And the next six I talked about, I think just about any system, they too would have been awarded. But you have gradations below that, and people who, were they really on the level of those people? I think one thing we can say about Pearl Harbor is that, that 83% of the awards are for people who were killed or seriously wounded. And that tells you something about one sort of base level about the award. I know when I was in service, it was folklore, but believed that basically you could improve your case, such as you could say that for getting a Medal of Honor or some high decorations by being killed or wounded. And in fact, I knew of a case of the troop commander I was with in Vietnam. I won't go into the details. We did this incredible feat of landing on basically chopping a landing zone to rescue some guys. We kept his rotors mounted outside the troop headquarters, and they were shredded. I saw pictures of the helicopter. They were, they've been sieved, whatever here. But miraculously, this guy was not hit. And one of my fellow officers, says, I think that's what lacked to put him over the top for Medal of Honor instead of the Distinguished Service Cross he got. He wasn't at least wounded, whatever here. And that's sort of part of my views on the process.
Well, that's really fascinating, and of course, I get similar insights from some of our recipients who are deeply involved with our museum from Afghanistan and Iraq. Have shared with me and others of us that the process remains, as you say, very subjective, and there was a perception for quite some time, and the global war on terror, that you'd have to be killed or wounded, severely wounded, in order to receive the Medal of Honor for whatever truth or lack thereof there may be in that. There's always going to be discussion on that point. So let's wrap up with this. The memory of Pearl Harbor remained powerful, of course, throughout World War II, and remains powerful today. But let's focus on the military, our armed forces today. does the memory of Pearl Harbor and the surprise at Pearl Harbor still resonate in anything more than a symbolic way? Is it still considered, taught, remembered in terms of how our military leaders today think about strategy, and also how we think about heroism and how we think about how our armed forces think about conduct in a situation like this? Does it still have meaning and resonance today?
I'm reluctant to pronounce on that. I mean, I just don't have enough current contact to be confident that I can really tell you. A couple of things that I do think you can see is that almost every serviceman has heard of Pearl Harbor. When they're given a low level of knowledge of American history, that in itself says something. I think at the higher levels, if not Pearl Harbor directly, the importance of surprise. And Pearl Harbor is an internal lesson in the importance of surprise, which also always plays a critical role in successful military operations. So I think it still sort of resonates there. In terms of practical day to day, I'm not sure that it has that much practical effect, but the symbolism of it remains there. Everyone who even remotely knows the story of there we were on Sunday morning and we got surprised. This is not something anyone wants to repeat. So yeah, I think there is a lingering effect of it, but I'd be careful about what I would identify as the effects of it.
Thank you. And obviously Pearl Harbor, no matter what, is a cultural touchstone for us. And I imagine to some degree it is for the Japanese, perhaps for different reasons than it is for us.
Yeah, the legacy in Japan is pretty subdued. I mean, there was a moment in the first 6 months of the expanded war from December 41, the Japanese were running wild. And of course, many Japanese thought they were going to win. And then, of course, the catastrophe of the end of the war and where Japan was reduced to pretty much dampened any enthusiasm about that. I do have one story. I don't want to use this, but it's interesting. A very good friend of mine was at the Army War College a number of years ago. And at the War College, they break down into these little subgroups for study. And his particular subgroup had a Japanese self-defense force officer as in the subgroup. Well, they did the fall semester, and it was the tradition at the end of the semester to have each little subgroup would have a party. And that year, the obvious date was a Saturday, and that date was December 7th. And so the members of the subgroup thought, "Oh my goodness, we don't want Tashi to think we're doing this." It's sort of some, subversive way of sort of getting a nudge at him because he's Japanese. So they sent a delegation to explain how this is all coming out. And all he did was he just smiled and says, "Well, you just have to remember that it was December 8th in Japan."
That's a great way to bring this interview to a close. I mean, that's is so interesting. I mean, Pearl Harbor is still so important, and the story is still so fascinating. And I know you describe it in great detail, as well as the larger context of the Asia Pacific War in your book. So Richard B. Frank, author of Tower of Skulls: A History of the Asia Pacific War, 1937 to 1942. Thank you so much for joining us for this interview. And I really look forward to the next volume. What's the next volume going to be titled, and when is it coming out?
Well, I have a tentative title. I think it's To Endure with Honor, but I'm not sure that's going to be the final version.
And that covers what years and when?
That'll cover from May 1942. Actually, I end volume 1 with the Japanese Empire's apogee, and the next day, volume 2 starts is the Battle of Coral Sea, where the downward slide starts over there. Volume 2 ends at the end of August 1944. Volume 3 starts in September 1944, and it will actually go into the post-war period and talk about how the events from 37 to 45 shaped the world we live in right down today. The most important element of that is without the events of that period, no People's Republic of China.
Oh, fantastic. If they're as good as Tower of Skulls was, I'm sure they'll be brilliant. You set yourself a high bar with the first volume, but keep on writing, and we look forward to the continuation of the trilogy. Thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you very much.